Hugo Münsterberg, 1863 to 1916. Not to be confused with Münster cheese, Hugo Münsterberg, the stereotypical German professor, was for a time a major celebrity, a phenomenal success in American psychology, very much in the public eye. He wrote hundreds of popular magazine articles and almost 2 dozen books in such applied areas as clinical, industrial, and forensic psychology. He was a frequent visitor to the White House as the guest of Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. Münsterberg was a powerful consultant to business and government leaders and counted among his acquaintances the rich and famous, including Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm, steel magnate Andrew Carnegie, philosopher Bertrand Russell, and assorted movie stars and intellectuals. He was frequently written about in the New York Times, which devoted some 18 editorials to his achievements. Hugo Münsterberg was also an honor professor at Harvard University and was elected president of both the APA and the American Philosophical Association. A founder of applied psychology in the United States and Europe, he was also one of only 2 psychologists ever accused of being a spy. Regardless of his espionage, he has been described as a prolific propagandizer for applied psychology. According to his biographer, Münsterberg was also a successful publicist, blessed with an uncanny flair for the sensational. His life can be read as a series of promotions of himself, his science, and his German fatherland. He was extremely self-centered and had a strong sense of importance. The philosopher George Santayana described him as pompous and egotistical beyond endurance. Münsterberg once told Santayana during a transatlantic crossing that it was, quote, surprising how many people are sailing on the ship simply because I am here, end quote. And then it all came crashing down. Toward the end of his life, Münsterberg became a figure of scorn and ridicule, the subject of newspaper cartoons and caricatures, an embarrassment to the university he had served for many years, and, quote, one of the most hated individuals in America, end quote. When he died in 1916, there were few eulogies for the man who had once been a giant in American psychology. Well, in 1882, at the age of 19, Münsterberg left his birthplace in Danzig, Germany, now Gdansk, Poland, and traveled to Leipzig to study medicine at the university. When he took a psychology course with Wilhelm Wundt, however, his career plans changed. The new science excited him, promising opportunities that medical research and practice did not. He earned his PhD from Wundt in 1885 and an MD from the University of Heidelberg 2 years later, expecting that both degrees would equip him better for a career in academic research. He accepted a teaching position at the University of Freiburg and set up a laboratory in his home at his own expense because the university lacked suitable facilities. He wrote articles about his experimental work in psychophysics, and soon students from all over Europe were flocking to his laboratory. He seemed well on his way to securing a major professorship and a reputation as a respected scholar. But then William James offered him the chance to become the highly paid director of Harvard's psychology laboratory in 1892. James, as mostly noted as a philosopher, resorted to flattery, telling Münsterberg that Harvard was America's greatest university and needed a genius to run its laboratory. Münsterberg would rather have stayed in Germany, but he was too ambitious to turn down the offer. The transition from Germany to the United States and from pure experimental psychology to applied psychology was difficult. At first, Münsterberg heartily disapproved of the spread of applied psychology. In an article in the American magazine Atlantic Monthly in 1898, he attacked colleagues who were applying psychology to education or who used questionnaires and other mental measurement techniques. In so doing, he alienated many leading psychologists, including Cattell. He also criticized those American psychologists who wrote for the general public, gave paid lectures to business leaders, and offered their services for a fee. However, it was not long before Münsterberg was doing these things himself. Obviously, why not capitulate on what's popular at the time? But anyway, having a decade at Harvard, perhaps realizing that no university in Germany was ever going to offer him a professorship, he wrote his first book in English. American Traits, in 1902, was a psychological, social, and cultural analysis of American society. A rapid and gifted writer, Münsterberg was able to dictate to a secretary a 400-page book in less than a month. William James said that Münsterberg's brain never seemed to get tired. The enthusiastic response to Münsterberg's book encouraged him to write more to the general public rather than to colleagues, and soon his work became a staple in popular magazines instead of psychology journals. He abandoned psychophysical research on the mind's contents to deal with everyday problems that psychologists could solve. His articles covered courtroom trials and the criminal justice system, advertising for consumer products, vocational counseling, mental health and psychotherapy, education, issues in business and industry, and even the psychology of motion pictures. He prepared correspondence courses on learning and business and made films about mental tests that were shown in movie theaters nationwide. Of course, Münsterberg never shied from controversy. During a sensational murder trial, he administered almost 100 mental tests to the confessed killer of 18 people who had accused a labor union leader of paying for the murders. On the basis of the test results, Münsterberg announced even before the jury reached its verdict in the labor leader's trial that the murderer's confession implicating the labor leader was true. When the jury then acquitted the labor leader, the damage to Münsterberg's credibility was enormous. A newspaper dubbed him Professor Monsterwerk. In 1908, Münsterberg became involved with Prohibition, the movement to ban the sale of alcoholic beverages. He argued against prohibition, citing his expertise as a psychologist, and expressed the position that alcoholic beverages in moderation could be beneficial. German-American beer brewers, including Adolphus Busch and Gustav Pabst, were delighted to have Münsterberg's support and made sizable financial contributions to Münsterberg's efforts to bolster Germany's image in the United States. Obviously, we have Busch and Pabst beers here in the United States. In a suspicious-looking bit of timing, Busch donated $50,000 for Münsterberg's proposed Germanic Museum, only a few weeks after Münsterberg published an article denouncing prohibition. The coincidence received considerable attention in the news media. Münsterberg's beliefs about women were also controversial. He was personally supportive of the education of several women graduate students at Harvard, including Mary Calkins. But in general, he thought that graduate work was too demanding for women. He declared that women should not be trained for careers because that took them away from the home, nor should women teach in the public schools because they were poor role models for boys. And women should not be allowed to serve on juries because they were incapable of rational deliberation. Of course, this last remark generated international newspaper headlines, and obviously it is sexist in its intent. Harvard's president and many of Münsterberg's colleagues were not pleased with his sensational comments to the press on controversial issues, nor did they approve of his interest in applied psychology. Of course, as a contrarian, I really could care less about what people have to say. But strained relations reached the breaking point over Münsterberg's vocal defense of his German homeland during World War I. American public opinion was decidedly anti-German. Germany was the aggressor in a war that had claimed millions of lives, but Münsterberg, still a German citizen, openly defended Germany. Newspapers reported that Münsterberg was a secret agent, a spy, or a high-ranking German military officer, and clamored for his resignation from Harvard. A London newspaper called him an agent for the German government. Neighbors suspected that the pigeons his daughter fed in the backyard of their house were carrying messages to other spies. A Harvard alumnus offered $10 million if the university would fire Münsterberg. Colleagues snubbed him, and he received death threats in the mail. The ostracism and virulent public attacks finally broke his spirit. On December the 16th of 1916, the newspapers published speculations about peace talks in Europe. Münsterberg said, "By spring we shall have peace," he told his, end quote, he told his wife. Then he set off on foot through deep snow to teach his morning class, but felt exhausted by the time he reached the lecture hall. He entered the classroom and spoke, quote, for about a half hour when he appeared to hesitate, and a moment later stretched his right hand towards the desk as though to steady himself. End quote. He fell to the floor without saying another word and died instantly of a massive stroke. Forensic psychology deals with psychology and the law. Münsterberg wrote magazine articles on such topics as crime prevention, using hypnosis to question suspects, administering mental tests to detect guilty persons, and the questionable trustworthiness of eyewitness testimony. He was particularly interested in the fallibility of human perception in viewing a criminal event and subsequently describing it as uh, accurately. He conducted research on simulated crimes in which witnesses were asked immediately after seeing the crime to describe what had occurred. The subjects disagreed on the details, even though the scene was still fresh in their memory. Münsterberg asked how accurate such testimony could be used in a courtroom when the event under discussion would have taken place many months earlier, or in some instances, many years earlier. So in 1908, he published a book titled On the Witness Stand, which described the psychological factors that can affect a trial's outcome. These include false confessions, the power of suggestion in the cross-examination of witnesses, and the use of physiological measurements such as the heart rate, blood pressure, and skin resistance in order to detect heightened emotional states in suspects and defendants. The book was reprinted in a new edition as recently as 2009, and a Kindle edition became available in 2013. The American Psychology Law Society was established in 1976 as a division of the APA to promote basic and applied research on forensic psychology. Münsterberg's 1909 book Psychotherapy focused on a different applied area. He treated patients in his laboratory rather than in a clinic. He never charged a fee. He insisted that his position conveyed the authority to make direct suggestions to patients about how they could be cured. He believed mental illness was really a behavioral maladjustment problem, not something attributable to underlying unconscious conflicts, as Sigmund Freud had claimed. There is no subconscious, Münsterberg announced. When Freud visited Clark University in 1909 at the invitation of G. Stanley Hall, Münsterberg left the country to avoid a confrontation. He returned only after Freud went back to Europe. Although Münsterberg's book on psychotherapy did much to bring the field of clinical psychology to public attention, it was not well received by Whitmer, who had opened his clinic at the University of Pennsylvania several years before. Whitmer had never achieved, nor had he desired, the popular acclaim that Münsterberg thrived on. In an article in his journal, Psychological Clinic, Whitmer complained that Münsterberg had cheapened the profession by hawking claims of cures in the marketplace. He called Münsterberg little better than a faith healer because of the jaunty way in which the professor of psychology at Harvard goes about the country claiming to have treated in his psychological laboratory hundreds and hundreds of cases of this or that form of nervous disorder. Münsterberg was also a promoter of industrial psychology. He embarked on this work in 1909 with an article titled Psychology in the Market, which covered several areas to which psychology could contribute: vocational guidance, advertising, personal management, mental testing, employee motivation, and the effects of fatigue and monotony on the job performance. He worked as a consultant for several companies and performed a great deal of practical research for them. He published his findings in a journal called Psychology and Industrial Efficiency in 1913, which was written for the general public. The book made the bestseller list. Münsterberg argued that the best way to increase job efficiency, productivity, and satisfaction was to select workers for positions that matched their mental and emotional abilities. How? By developing the proper psychological selection techniques, such as mental tests and job simulations, to assess the applicant's knowledge, skills, and abilities. I could not agree more. Münsterberg conducted research on such diverse occupations as ship captain, streetcar driver, telephone operator, and salesperson to show his selection techniques could improve job performance. His studies also showed that talking while working decreased efficiency. His solution was not to prohibit conversation among the workers, which would likely engender hostility, but to redesign the workplace to make it difficult for workers to talk to one another. He suggested increasing the distance between machine workstations in the factory or separating office workers' desks with partitions, a forerunner of today's office cubicles. And so Münsterberg formulated no theories, he started no new school of thought, and he conducted no academic research once he became an applied psychologist. However, His research served the purpose of business. It was functional research that was oriented toward helping people in some way. Although he had been trained by Wundt in the introspective method, he criticized colleagues who were unwilling to use other psychological methods and findings for the betterment of humanity. The overriding idea that characterized Münsterberg's colorful and controversial career was that psychology be useful, it be pragmatic. For all his Germanic temperament, he was the quintessential American functional psychologist, reflecting and displaying the spirit of his times, the zeitgeist. Although Münsterberg was an amazing figure, it seems that he had many different interests. Applied psychology in the United States. I'm going to just briefly speak about applied psychology in the United States. Cattell wrote that the contributions of psychologists during World War I put psychology on the map and on the front page. Hall commented that the war had given applied psychology a tremendous impulse. This will, on the whole, to do good for psychology. We must not try to be too pure. Some journals, such as the Journal of Experimental Psychology, ceased publication during the war years, but the Journal of Applied Psychology thrived. By the time the war ended in 1918, applied psychology had become far more respectable within the profession as a whole. Applied psychology is scientific work, declared Thorndike. Making psychology for business or industry or the army is harder than making psychology for other psychologists, and intrinsically requires higher talents. Academic psychology also benefited from the success of applied psychology during the war years. For the first time, there were enough jobs and financial support for university psychologists. New psychology departments were established, new buildings and laboratories constructed, and more funds appropriated for faculty salaries. The American Psychological Association membership increased threefold, from 336 members in 1917 to over 1,100 in 1930. Still more, most academic psychologists looked on applied psychology with disdain. Louis Terman, who developed the Stanford-Binet intelligence test, as we have mentioned earlier, recalled that many of the old-line psychologists regarded the whole test movement with scorn. I had the feeling that I hardly counted as a psychologist. The APA, controlled by the academic branch of psychology, changed the membership requirements in 1919. Candidates for membership had to have published experimental research. In effect, this eliminated the possibility of membership for many applied psychologists, and certainly for most women psychologists whose employment opportunities were largely limited to applied work. And despite this negative attitude towards applied psychology on the part of many university psychologists, its popularity skyrocketed, and it became something of a national mania. People came to believe that psychologists could fix everything, from marital disharmony to job dissatisfaction, and sell everything from automobiles to toothpaste. New magazines actively promoted the field. Among the most popular were The Modern Psychologist, and a magazine with even more promising-sounding title, Psychology, with the subtitle, Health, Happiness, Success. A 1923 editorial in the New York Times noted that, quote, the new psychology is making its way into one domain after another of human activity, and always proves its value, end quote. An increasing clamor for solutions to real-world problems drew more and more psychologists away from academic research and into applied areas. In the 1921 edition of Cattell's American Men of Science, more than 75% of the listed psychologists reported doing applied work. In 1910, the figure had been 50%. The meetings of the APA's New York branch in the early 1920s show a substantial increase from pre-war days in the number of papers dealing with applied issues. However, by the 1930s, the decade of the worldwide economic depression, applied psychology came under attack for failing to live up to its promises. Of course, business leaders complained that industrial psychologists were not curing all their corporate ills. The New York Times and other influential newspapers criticized psychologists for overstating their abilities and failing to ameliorate the malaise created by the economic depression. Of course, the economic depression was so deep that nothing psychology could have done would have changed the disastrous economic conditions which plagued the entire world. Psychologists cannot do everything, obviously, Public attention to psychology declined during the Depression, and its image was not restored until 1941 when the United States entered World War II. And thus we again see that war has been a significant influence on psychology's development in the 20th century. World War II, which lasted from 1941 to 1945 historically, provided a different set of problems for psychology and revived and expanded its influence. Fully 25% of American psychologists were directly involved in the war effort, and many others made indirect contributions through research and writing. One major effort was led by historian of psychology E.G. Boring, who assembled a team of nearly 40 psychologists to write a book for those training to be soldiers. It was titled Psychology for the Fighting Man, with the subtitle, What You Should Know About Yourself and Others, and it became one of the most popular books of the era. The psychologist gave advice on every aspect of a soldier's life in war, from morale and training to food and sex. Boring's co-editor was the journalist Vandy Water. She wrote the psychologist's prose to make it more user-friendly for the non-academic audience. Initially, Boring asked her to appear under a male pseudonym out of deference to the Army. She vetoed this plan, however. Women psychologists had a few opportunities to participate in war work. Some were advised to do community volunteer work instead. Of the 1,006 psychologists who served in the United States Armed Forces, only 33 were women. Of course, this makes sense for the spirit of the times. However, World War II and the changed conditions of post-war American life resulted in exponential growth in every area of psychology and created the need for a greater number of professional psychologists than ever before in the United States' history. In the last half of the 20th century, applied psychology outstripped the academic, research-oriented psychology that had dominated for so many years. No longer was it true that the majority of psychologists worked in universities, conducting experimental research. And it is even less true today, where fewer than 30% of psychologists work in academic settings. The rest are in the still rapidly growing applied areas of the field. Of course, one result of this was a shift in power within the American Psychological Association, where applied psychologists, particularly clinical psychologists, now assume a commanding position. In 1988, a group of academic and research-oriented members revolted and founded their own organization, the American Psychological Society, the APS. Of course, as we see, most psychologists today are clinical psychologists because that's where most psychologists can find jobs. It's very hard to find a job as a psychologist at a university. The nature of American psychology changed immensely in the years since Hall, Cattell, Whitmer, Scott, and Münsterberg studied with Wilhelm Wundt in Germany and brought that psychology to the United States. Psychology is no longer restricted to lecture halls, libraries, and laboratories, but now extends into many areas of everyday life. Today, applied psychologists work in testing, educational and school psychology, clinical and counseling psychology, industrial organizational psychology, forensic psychology, community psychology, consumer psychology, population and environmental psychology, health and rehabilitation psychology, family services, exercise and sports psychology, military psychology, media psychology, addictive behaviors, religion, culture, and concerns of minority groups. None of these areas of application would have been possible had psychology remained focused on mental elements or the content of conscious experience. The people, ideas, and events described in earlier chapters on the functionalist school of thought compelled American psychology to move far beyond the confines of Wundt's Leipzig laboratory. Consider the following agents of that massive change. First, you had Darwin's notion of adaptation and function. Second, you had Galton's measurement of individual differences. Third, you had the American intellectual focus on the practical and the useful, the pragmatic approach. Fourth, you had the shift within academic research laboratories from content to function brought about by William James, Engel, and Woodworth. And then fifthly, you had the economic and social factors and the forces of war at play. And all those forces intertwined to bring forth the active, assertive, engaging, and influential science of psychology that has changed our lives. This overall movement in American psychology toward the practical was reinforced by the next school of thought in psychology's evolution, the school known as behaviorism.